Now, if you're anything like me, you've committed grammar mistakes multiple times online. Particularly, one of my big problems is I always forget the not in contractions. So I'll say is instead of is not, which obviously changes the meaning quite a bit and is extremely problematic. But I think what's even more distressing is when you make those sort of mistakes, it's quite frequent that people will call you out on it, right? That they will view you as less intelligent or less educated because you spelled your wrong or used the wrong there or that sort of thing, right? And so that's really the subject of Amanda Montell's chapter that we read for today. She focuses a lot on grammatical gender and pronoun usage, but her real point is about how we go about policing other people's grammar. And so what I'm going to do here in this video is I'm going to extend her ideas to a certain degree and cover some topics that she doesn't really have time to focus on. So anyway, so this video is about grammar policing, it's about social control, it's about those sorts of things. So let's go ahead and get started. By now, you're familiar with the pattern, so this is the point where I splash Amanda Montell's face on the screen and give you some details about her background. And I do want to talk about some things. There are some details I feel like you should know before we get started. So she's 28 years old, so by far the youngest author we've looked at in this class. She got her undergraduate degree in linguistics from New York University. She's currently working as a journalist, and she does a lot of work for publications like Pop Sugar and Marie Claire and so forth. And this is her first book, and it's a pretty good book. It does a pretty good job of giving you an overview of the intersection between feminism and linguistic studies. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, I think this is a good primer for those sorts of issues. But of course, I don't want to say too much more because she's really adept at social media herself. She obviously does a lot of work on YouTube and so forth, and so she's introduced herself numerous times. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to her so she can talk about her own history. And then when we're finished, we're going to move forward and talk about these thorny issues of grammar policing that I want to discuss in this video.
I've literally had more than one boss tell me have more poise. That part of my personality is why this book happened. Like, I have a book called Word Slut. If I had more poise, it wouldn't have happened. My name is Amanda Montell, and we are at my apartment in Culver City, California. I have thought a lot about this actually this year, what it means to live beautifully. Recently, to me, I find that it means to live generously. Not necessarily generous like you're always donating your money somewhere or something like that, but at every turn to sort of give of yourself. I just started volunteering recently at this organization called the Trevor Project, which is a suicide prevention and crisis intervention hotline for LGBTQ youth. That I've found has given my life so much beauty. The words we speak absolutely have power. Language can be used as a power tool, a weapon. I mean, people don't take it as seriously. There's that idiom like sticks and stones or whatever. But that's not true. People can be seriously oppressed with language or seriously lifted up. My mom's dad, my pawpaw, who was the closest family member to me, he was just this incredibly effervescent, vibrant person who I aspire to be like. He was a scientist and an actor. He died this year. He's why I do anything in life that could be seen as generous. He was generous. You know, my book is called A Feminist Guide to Taking Back the English Language. The book basically takes a shitload of academic studies that are pretty dry and inaccessible, talking about language and gender and language and feminism, and makes them digestible and fun for a general reader. It's just about bringing this information to people's consciousness and then allowing them to make their own informed decision. I do a lot of saving of posts by Instagram poets, and there's this one, it goes, I want to live so densely lush and slow in the next few years that a year becomes 10 years and the past becomes only a page in the book of my life. Dude, that's what it is to live beautifully. I changed my fucking answer. I just want to not future trip. I want to not worry about what's going to happen in a year or even next week. I want to live so densely lush and slow that an hour becomes a year.
Hopefully you enjoyed that video. Amanda Montell is definitely more cool than I ever was. When I was 28, I was just going to graduate school and playing video games, and it seems like she has something of an interesting life going on. All right, anyway, let's go talk about these issues of grammar policing that I want to discuss in this video. So hopefully one of the things that's occurred to you is that professors' obsession with grammar is a little weird. It's a little fishy. For example, I had a student that came into the Writing Center once. She was a Polish student, and she was taking a graduate course. And her professor had spilled red ink all over her paper. And this student was really distraught. She was crying when she came in. And most of the grammar mistakes that the professor was marking were things they're just natural for a non-native speaker to do. So stuff about articles and verb tense and that sort of stuff. And that wasn't doing any good, right? It wasn't doing the student good because she was frustrated. It wasn't doing the professor any good because she wasn't really teaching the student anything, right? And so there was a lot of frustration to sort of get past around in that particular scenario. So there's definitely something weird about our obsession with grammar. And the one thing I want to say before we get started is it has nothing to do with communication. Now, there are some issues where grammar and communication are linked, right? So, for example, that case I talked about earlier where I'm forgetting the not in my contractions, that obviously has a huge effect on the meaning. Verb tense would be another example. Making sure you have the right verb tense definitely is important, right? But a lot of the issues that we consider most problematic have nothing to do with issues of communication. So here's just a simple example before we get started. So the dog walked down the street. So the misspelling of the there would probably strike a lot of people as really problematic. Has nothing to do with communication. We can still really easily understand what the author's trying to say. Another example, now we're starting to get into some of the more thorny issues. Your mom talk about the fishes, right? So obviously they're using the incorrect you're in that situation. They're also using the plural verb when they should be using the singular verb to match the singular noun, right? So this strikes us as really problematic, but once again, nothing to do with the meaning. We still clearly can understand what this person's trying to say, right? Here's another example that's going to be grating for a few of you. Person ate banana because tasty, right? So the main thing that's missing here is the articles, right? So the person ate a banana because it was tasty, right? But article, what's funny about that, first off, the meaning's clear here. We know what the person's trying to say. And article usage is something that's very unique to English and something that non-native speakers from a variety of other languages have a lot of trouble with. In fact, I had a Cuban-American professor once when I asked her what was the most difficult part about learning to speak the English language. She got really frustrated and said, damn it, I think the only reason they have articles in English is to distinguish between native and non-native speakers. And there's some truth to that. The articles usually don't do a whole lot of work as far as the meaning goes, right? So anyway, so typically this isn't about communication. There's something else going on here that strikes us as problematic. Now things start to get really weird with grammar textbooks, but before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit about the difference between prescriptive and descriptive grammar, right? So prescriptive grammar basically tells us how we should talk or write. A good example of that would be Amanda Mattel's argument that we should use the third person plural pronoun, they, instead of the third person singular pronoun, he or she, right? In that case, it's almost like a moral prescription, right? In other cases, it's not quite so strict, So, for example, it's often said you shouldn't end a sentence with a preposition, right? That's another good example of prescriptive grammar. Now, descriptive grammar, in contrast, just tells us the way language actually works, right? And so a good way to understand this distinction might be to think in terms of ain't. Prescriptively, we're often told not to use ain't. It's viewed as improper or whatever, right? But descriptively, people use ain't all the time. There's no grammatical problem with it. People use that in their normal everyday discourse, and everybody understands exactly what they're saying, right? And so this is a real important distinction to keep in mind, especially when we start looking closer at grammar textbooks. So one piece of prescriptive grammar that's real common in a lot of grammatical textbooks is the prohibition against the passive voice, right? And so just to make it clear what the passive voice is, before we get into this in more detail, here's an example, right? So the passive voice is basically when the actor of the sentence is not the subject of the sentence, right? So an example of the passive voice would be something like the candle was eaten by the dog, right? Now, in contrast, the active voice is when the actor of the sentence is in the subject of the sentence, right? And so a good example of that would be the dog ate the candle, right? Now, a lot of people argue that you shouldn't use the passive voice because it's more concise and more clear to not do that, right? And what's funny about this is there's all kinds of contexts where people use the passive voice. One really good example is in scientific writing, where they love the passive voice for a variety of reasons, right? But when you start to look at the style textbooks, it's kind of interesting how they treat this topic, right? So here's an example of a style textbook, right, where they tell you not to use the passive voice while using the passive voice themselves, right? So let me go and read this. They say emphasis is often achieved by the use of verbs rather than nouns formed from them, and by the use of verbs in the active rather than the passive voice, right? And so this example is really funny because in the act of telling you not to use the passive voice, they in fact use the passive voice, right? So this should sort of add to that sense that there's something fishy going on with all these, this obsession we have with prescriptive grammar. And studies that we've done on this subject have emphasize this point, that people seem really concerned about grammar and often use it to make judgments about the person's character, right? So this is a landmark study in my field. It's done by a man named Larry Beeson. It was published in 2001 in the flagship journal in my field, right? And it's a limited study in a lot of ways. It only involved 14 or so subjects, right? And basically what he did is he gave the person various business documents that had clearly labeled errors throughout the text, right? And then they went through and talked about how bothersome they found each of the errors, right? But the important part of the study is afterwards he interviewed them about what they think about the writer of those particular sentences. And what he found is pretty interesting and provocative in a lot of ways, right? So they said the following things about the character of the writers. They said things like that they were poorly educated, that they weren't a detail person, that they were faulty thinkers, right? Which is all kind of interesting in a lot of ways, right? Some of the comments they made, they said things like, it's somewhat bothersome because if someone makes an error in writing a word, are they going to make an error in typing a number, right? And so you see a person here conflating two entire domains of practice, right? Just because I can write well doesn't mean I'm going to be good at like accounting or something like that, right? The connection there is ridiculous when you think about it, right? Another connection here, those are glaring. That's junior high. Why do so many kids get out of high school, get out of school without a minimum level of skills, right? So once again, assumptions made about the person's education, right? Very little understanding that errors are inevitable, they happen to everybody, and then in fact, in a lot of professional contexts, we have people to deal with them, editors, right? Those are the people that deal with errors for us in a lot of cases, right? And this study has been replicated a number of times. The most recent example was just published recently. I think it was just a couple months ago. And this study is significantly larger. It looks at 94 participants, of which only 88 are represented here. 2/3 of them were female, about 1/3 of them were male, so on and so forth. And one of the differences in the approach here is they included some questions in a survey afterwards and asked them to make some judgments about the person, right? And you can see here almost over 80% of the subjects said the writer is careless because there were some errors in their work, right? And then there are some other judgments people were making, like that they're uninformed, that they're indifferent. Very few people said none of these, which is probably how I would respond to something like that. So yeah, really interesting how ramped up we get about errors and how we're willing to make judgments about people's characters based on that stuff, right? So why is this, right? There's a couple reasons, right? So one of the reasons has to do with what I would call snobbery or class judgment. So very often we make class judgments about people based on their facility with standard American English or whatever, right? So here's an example. This is an example I've used for a long time. This guy on the left is actually a protester from the Iraq War back in 2003. This is a really famous photo that circulated around the internet for a long time. And you can see he's got that sign, "Get a brain, Morans, go USA," right? And then you have this person on the right that seems to be responding to that, where he says, protest signs are more effective when spelled correctly, right? So really taking it to that protester on the left there, right? And so that's part of it. Part of why we feel compelled to do that is because facility with standard American English is one class indicator, right? And so that's what some of the judgments we're making are, right? Some of this is about race. There's no question about that too. And she mentions African American vernacular English in the book, but there's all kinds of other things. I was talking about non-native speakers earlier, and I think that's important too. So this is from a comic called American Born Chinese. It's a really interesting comic that deals with stereotypes of Chinese people in the United States. And this is the character in the back with the glasses is an immigrant character, and whenever he's talking in the brackets there, he's speaking in Chinese. So he says, "Sorry to bother you, but you're Chinese, aren't you?" Right? And then the American-born Chinese person says, "You're in America. Speak English." You Chinese person? And he says, "Yes." Right? And so you see, it forces him to go through his sort of tortured English to make some sort of response there, right? So I just want to bring us back to something Amanda Montell says. So she says, when highly educated folks engage in grammar policing, they're basically just doing what misogynists do when they dismiss what a woman is saying because she uses uptalk or vocal fry. It's another example of judging someone's speech based on preconceptions of who they are, right? And I think there's a lot of truth to this, right? That we're judging people's grammar, that very often it's a stand-in for other kinds of judgments that we want to make. So race judgments, class judgments, all those sorts of things, right? Now, of course, this doesn't mean you don't have to learn this stuff, right? Because obviously, as we can see with those earlier studies, there are people out in the world that make these judgments all the time, right? But what you can do, your little small part of creating change in the world around you, is that when you go out into the workplace, right, and you receive that resume or that cover letter that's got the little grammatical mistake on page 2, right? You don't be the person that makes those kinds of judgments about that person, right? Because you could be inadvertently, judging them based on things that you don't want to, right? You might be judging them based on the fact that they were raised with an African-American vernacular English, right? You may be judging them simply because their native language is in English, right? And so the goal of this lecture in some ways is to get you to think at least a little more carefully about some of that stuff.